Good morning, folks. Welcome back to the Food for the Faithful channel with me, Bill Reimer, your ever so reluctant prophet. Despite the fact that I'm losing viewers, I won't be discouraged by that. First of all, more than anything, I believe that you have freedom of choice and that you will choose to consume whatever you wish to consume. If you find this too difficult, it's not for you. However, if you wish to understand what ideologies are causing the government to create the policies that it's creating, that are deeply structurally damaging the country, please follow, because I will explain them to you in detail as simplistically as I possibly can. Because any fool can tell you what's wrong, but it takes an expert to tell you how to correct it. First of all, you have to do a root cause analysis of what's going on. What is the root cause of the problem? And what can we do to address it? So let me begin. Postmodern cultural relativism has eroded our common cultural narratives and shared values, thereby undermining the cohesive identity and consistent principles that historically have defined Canadian governments. The shift has fragmented societal cohesion, complicated policy making, and ultimately challenges the foundations of our national unity. This, in short, explains why Canada feels so broken under our current governing plutocratic elite. They're using our tax money as their personal piggy bank. They're kleptomaniacal when it comes to the use of our taxes, lining their own pockets and those of their friends. So our government long ago broke faith with its citizens, yet we have continued to vote for this tyranny. Why is this happening to us? It is happening because it appeals to Canadians' sense of empathy for the little guy. Yet instead of protecting the downtrodden, the valid emotion of empathy has been weaponized by the radical left. By stealth, they have taken the long march through our institutions to capture them from within. As a result, our natural inclination to be empathetic has been weaponized to destroy the very nature of Canadian parliamentary democracy. God save us from the kleptocracy that has captured our government. This touches on some complex and deeply debated ideas around cultural identity, governance, and political theory. I want to unpack the concepts of postmodern cultural relativism, critical theory, and cultural Marxism in a clear and honest way. Here's a brief overview of the key ideological concepts. Postmodern cultural relativism. This is an idea that values, norms, and truth are not universal, but instead are shaped by cultural context. Postmodernism often challenges grand narratives and fixed truths, promoting skepticism toward institutions and traditional authority. Cultural relativism within this framework suggests that no single culture's values are inherently superior to that of another's. This flies in the face of cultural Marxist critical race, gender, and climate catastrophizing theory, which in fact are grand narratives. What's critical theory? A type of grand narrative originating from the Frankfurt School in the early 20th century. Critical theory seeks to critique and change society by examining power structures, ideologies, and social injustices. It often focuses on how societal institutions perpetuate inequality and aims to empower marginalized groups. Most importantly, critical theory is a method of examining Marxism, since Marxist ideas constantly evolve. The obvious reason for this is that Marxism itself doesn't work in a practical sense. Hence the need for it to constantly adjust its core premises. However, the one thing which remains consistent is its loathing for free market capitalism. So what is cultural Marxism? Some claim this term is controversial and often misused, but is it? Originally, it referred to the application of Marxist ideas to cultural analysis, looking at how culture can reinforce class structures. However, in recent years, cultural Marxism has been used in political rhetoric to describe perceived leftist influence in institutions. The reason for this assumption has come from the writings of renowned leftists who themselves stated that they would take the long march through our institutions to capture them from within. The long march through the institutions, in German, der lange Marsch durch die Institutionen, is a slogan coined by socialist student activist Rudi Dutschke around 1967 to describe his strategy to create radical change in government, particularly West Germany, by becoming part of it. The phrase Long March is a reference to the physical long march of the Chinese Communist Army. Nevertheless, many scholars argue that the usage is misleading and conflates different intellectual traditions, even though I will use the left's own language to prove to you otherwise. How these things interact. Postmodernism undermines universal narratives, which can weaken shared cultural foundations. Critical theory critiques existing power structures, including those within culture, education, and governance. Even though postmodernism denies the existence of a grand narrative, the New Left nevertheless combines these frameworks into a grand narrative that challenges traditional institutions and values, which has tremendous destabilizing effects, though the left argues that destabilization is necessary for social progress. Now that is quite an assertion. How can destroying civil society promote civility when these radical leftist ideologies advocate for violent protests and civil disobedience? So let's do a deeper dive into how these ideas have influenced Canadian institutions or policy making, and explore alternative perspectives on national unity and governance. So here's a comprehensive breakdown of how postmodern cultural relativism, critical theory, and cultural Marxism have influenced Canadian governments, institutions, and national identity, and how these ideas interact with each other. 1. Postmodern cultural relativism in Canadian governance. Postmodernism challenges the idea of universal truths and promotes the view that values are culturally constructed. In Canada, this is manifested through multiculturalism policy. Since 1971, Canada has embraced multiculturalism, allowing diverse cultural groups to maintain their traditions while participating in mainstream society. This policy has helped redefine Canadian national identity as inclusive and pluralistic. Governance impacts. While multiculturalism has fostered integration and reduced anti-immigrant backlash, critics like myself argue it has also led to fragmented identities and weakened shared civic values, complicating policymaking and national cohesion, especially given the fact that we are currently witnessing aggressive anti-Semitism here in Canada, which is accompanied by violent radical Islamic protests. Two, critical theory's influence on Canadian institutions. Critical theory, especially in its educational form, which is critical pedagogy, has gained traction in Canadian schools and universities. Education. Ontario's Ministry of Education has increasingly adopted critical theory language, focusing on identity, power, and systemic oppression. Critics argue this shift undermines traditional literacy and numeracy goals, and many erode civic unity. Libraries and higher education. Institutions like the CFLA, FCAB have embraced critical theory to address moral panics and promote inclusivity, though this has sparked debates about neutrality and ideological bias. Many renowned professors, such as Dr. Gad Saad and Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, have been sounding a warning for decades that our universities have become institutions for radical neo-Marxist indoctrination. Design and curriculum. Canadian universities are using critical instructional design to embed social justice into learning environments, especially in Indigenous education and health programs. This, even though injustices remain at an all-time high, with open and violent outbursts against both Jews and Christians. Synagogues are being attacked and churches have been burnt. Yet our radical leftist government refuses to address these problems effectively while merely doubling down on its failed neo-Marxist policies. 3. Cultural Marxism, contested concept and Canadian context. The term cultural Marxism is claimed to be highly controversial, despite this is a term invented by the left. It astounds me how the left becomes enraged when we throw their own words back at them. Origin and usage. It refers to the idea that Marxist principles have shifted from economic class struggle to cultural institutions. Critics claim this has led to ideological capture of education and media. Academic debate. Scholars argue that while Marxist-inspired critiques of culture exist, e.g. Antonio Gramsci and the Frankfurt School, the term cultural Marxism is often poorly understood. This is true for the simple reason that leftist rhetoric is often incomprehensible and deliberately arcane. It sounds like madness. Policy and identity. Some view multiculturalism and progressive education as vehicles for disseminating cultural Marxist ideas, while others see them as necessary for equity and inclusion. The fact remains that none of the left's stated goals are being achieved. In fact, the outcome of their policies has resulted in the diametric opposite of their favorite word, progressivism. Number 4, national unity and cultural identity in Canada. Canada's identity has devolved through multiculturalism, failed reconciliation efforts, and debates over what constitutes shared values. Multiculturalism versus unity. While multiculturalism is claimed to be a source of pride, it hasn't translated into support for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. That problem, despite all claims, has proved to be unsolvable using the government's so-called progressive policies. Collective multicultural ideals in shaping civic engagement has also destroyed the very idea of the sovereign and the autonomous individual. Cultural institutions. Institutions like CBC, Radio Canada, were created to foster national unity, but their role is increasingly politicized, especially in elections. In fact, they have become the Canadian government's version of Reich Rundfunk Gesellschaft, RRG, or Reich Broadcasting Corporation, which was used extensively for Nazi propaganda after 1933. Overseen by Joseph Goebbels' Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Do you notice the use of similar terms between our government and Nazi Germany? The RRG's broadcasts were controlled and used to indoctrinate the German public and promote Nazi ideology. So here's my point. This is precisely what the CBC has become. The propaganda mouthpiece of the Prime Minister's office. Identity crisis. Some argue Canada lacks a cohesive identity beyond not being the U.S. and needs a clearer vision rooted in shared values like fairness and resilience. And I second this argument, but will go further. We literally no longer know who we are. And frankly, we no longer know who we are because we no longer know who God is. Without the grand narrative provided by Christianity, the entire enchilada comes toppling down. We can see this today with brutal clarity. From the second book of Chronicles, chapter 7, verse 14, from the King James Version of the Bible. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. This is the only way that Canada will have responsible government restored. A Christian nation, one nation, under God. As the Americans say, indivisible, because of our common faith in Christ. These are things to think and pray about on this October the 18th. God bless you all. You have a lovely day.